The kettle began its shriek, the same second the Los Angeles number lit my phone, and for a moment both sounds braided together into a rope that tugged me straight back through 40 years. I still had flour on my hands from dusting a pound cake pan. I still had my satin headscarf tilted sideways like I was going to battle with a Sunday breeze. I picked up on the third ring, wiped my palm on the house dress I swore I wasn't about to wear outside, and said hello in my radio voice. Low, steady, church soloist warm. The man on the other end thanked me for picking up and said he represented a global artist whose name my granddaughter, Nyla, had once screamed when he floated down from the ceiling at an awards show in a harness. He said they had sampled a fragment of a 1982 gospel recording from the Mount Zion Broadcast Chorale and traced the lead voice in that call and response to a young woman named Loretta Sullivan. Miss Sullivan, he added, as if laying a velvet cloth on the table. That would be you. It took me a second to answer because that year was a whole other life, and because the kettle was still carrying on like a warning siren. That would be me, I said, and turned the burner off with my elbow. The numbers he named settled over my kitchen like a sudden, impossible snowfall. Back royalties. Future participation. A settlement figure attached to my signature, and the release of a catalog. Nobody had thought to value until a billionaire decided my "Yes, Lord" could be flipped into a hook. I put the phone on speaker and sat down to keep from falling over. My late husband, Louis, would have grinned and done the math 3 ways in his head. But Louis had been gone 12 years, and the bills that had learned to march in his absence stood at attention in my mailbox every 1st and 15th. I'll need time to think and proper counsel, I said, because 64 had taught me to dress excitement in sensible shoes. The attorney complimented my caution and emailed a draft, then promised that someone from the label would be in touch after I'd retained representation. When I hung up, my kitchen window caught me in its reflection, and I didn't recognize the woman blinking back eyes, bright as new coins, age lines deep and honest. Grief softened into something like shine. I laughed, then one sharp, disbelieving bark, and reached for the sugar like it could make anything sweeter than that call. The laugh was still in my mouth when the distant crack stitched down my block. It was the sound of a fender kissing the wrong angle at the wrong speed, followed by a bloom of brake screech that vibrated the spoons in their drawer. My little blue Toyota leaped on the curb in front of my house, like a spooked animal, glass hailing the sidewalk, the hood crumpling into a bitter smile. A pickup hadn't so much swerved as decided that my parked car owed it an apology and collected it in payment. The driver climbed out, looked at the damage like he'd found the sky rude, and peeled away before I made it to the porch. I stood barefoot on Inez Avenue with my robe flapping against my calves and watched my reflection tremble in 1,000 glittering shards. Somewhere in my pocket, my phone buzzed again. By evening, I had the police report, a neighbor's shaky clip of the hit and run, and the strange certainty that someone had taken the measure of my new windfall and already begun counting it. That night, I told Nyla over FaceTime, her eyes wide and beautiful and full of questions I could not yet answer, that Nana's voice was finally bringing home more than claps and casseroles. She made me promise to let her design my first Chex celebration cake. Pink frosting, gold sprinkles, edible glitter. We're gonna cut it with the good knife, she said, and I promised. When we hung up, my living room quiet sounded like a stage before a show the hush of breath held and curtains heavy in the dark. The next morning, my son, Malik, called me Ma, twice like the word was stuck to the roof of his mouth. Malik was 41 years old and still wore ambition like a coat he hadn't quite grown into. Under that, he was my baby with the cowlick and the mouth that could talk a kite back down on a windless day. I heard, he said, and I could hear other voices beneath his, the hum of a shared workspace he never seemed to leave. The fizz of coffee machines and men in jackets nodding big ideas at each other. Nyla told me, "That's, wow." "It is," I said, waiting for him to ask how I was and when I'd slept and if the Toyota had insurance. He asked about timing. He asked about percentages. He asked if I needed him to meet with the label on my behalf, since he'd been reading about intellectual property and could translate. "Slow down," I told him. I've got Harrison for that. And Lord, the way his breath caught at the name. Harrison had been our family's attorney since Lewis's shop got sued over a slip and fall in '97. Harrison had ushered us through that storm. And a dozen others. He was as steady as an old oak and as boring as a lecture on tax code, which is exactly what I needed. Ma, Malik said, voice softening. Just keep me looped. Sloane's been researching conservatorships. For artists, you know? So, nothing gets mismanaged. She says the smart thing is, you get ahead of it. Sloane. A woman whose smile didn't quite touch her beautiful eyes, and whose arm never hung all the way down when she hugged me, like she was mindful of the price tag on her sleeve. They'd been together 8 months, and married 3. She'd planned the wedding in a week and called it minimalist. She'd explained my own collard greens to me at Thanksgiving, and corrected my pastor's scripture reference on Christmas Eve. But she also sang to Nyla at bedtime when Malik was working late and brought my trash bins up from the curb when the wind pushed them down the block. So, I'd decided the Lord and time would tell who she really was. Conservatorship tasted like old pennies on my tongue. Tell Sloane I'm not a pop star with a Vegas residency, and a mama who shaved my head in a gas station. This is my voice and my business, I said. And Malik laughed just a little. Just enough to pull the day back from its edge. If that had been the end of it, I could have said I was a woman lucky in her lessons and moved on. But the world rarely hands you a single plotline at once. 2 days later, a deacon from New Risen Hope knocked and asked if I might be available the following week to meet with Reverend Cole, because there's been talk about stewardship, Miss Loretta. Stewardship, in church mouth, can mean anything from, we need you to chair the bake sale, to, we've already spent that money you haven't received. I told him I'd pray on it, and closed my door with my palm planted flat against the wood like I could feel the sime. Whispers seeping through. Harrison came on Tuesday with readers perched on his nose, and the contract from Los Angeles printed on heavy paper that made even nonsense look official. He sat at my dining room table and read like he was peeling an onion layer by layer, tear by tear. The terms were fair. The retroactive check looked like a phone number. The future percentage made my head light. We'll have a forensic accountant verify their royalty numbers, but this is clean, he said, tapping with his pen. Congratulations, Loretta. It should have been a straight path from that signature to that deposit to that cake, Nyla promised. But the day after Harrison filed my acceptance, a woman named Dr. Stanford called from a clinic across town and said she'd been referred to evaluate cognitive resilience post-head injury. I hadn't had a head injury. Your son and daughter-in-law were concerned, she said. And that word, concerned, slid like oil across a screen I'd kept clear. She had an appointment reserved for me tomorrow. When I told her no, thank you, I'd keep my appointments with Dr. Gupta, the neurologist who had done my checkups since my thanks in advance 10 years ago. She tesked and said waiting could be dangerous. I hung up. 10 minutes later, Sloane called and told me Dr. Stanford was the best in the city, and she'd already signed the intake forms on my behalf to save me time. I listened and thought about that pickup hitting my Toyota and about the kettle scream and the attorney's velvet voice and the deacon's stewardship and the way my own name had felt strange and expensive when that Los Angeles number spoke. I thought about Malik as a boy, bringing me rocks from the schoolyard, because he liked the way they looked, like they might hold something bright inside if he split them open. Baby, I said to Sloane, though she'd asked me not to call her that. Tell me where you learned to care this much about my calendar. She paused just long enough. We care about you, she said. We care about our family. Our family, I repeated. And when I hung up, I reached for the number of the one person whose job it had been, 3 decades straight, to mistrust everything until proof shook it by the hand. Bertie had carried a bag for the Postal Inspection Service for 28 years. She had smiled sweetly at counterfeiters while recording their lies, and had sat in back seats watching men carry duffels full of regret into warehouses with no alarms. She'd retired into the soft safety of mahjong and midday naps, and still kept a police scanner on her kitchen counter, like a cat keeps a sunny spot on the floor. When I told her about the call and the pickup and the deacon and the doctor who materialized out of concern, she turned her volume down and said, "You feel it, don't you? The air in your house just shifted." "I feel foolish," I said, and mad at myself for feeling foolish. Bertie, whose hands had cuffed men while her purse swung politely from her shoulder, came over with her small notebook and a cheap pen, and sat in my armchair like it was an unmarked car. "Let's do what we do," she said. "Let's make a list of facts, even if your body's already told you the story." We traced the calls. We confirmed the clinic. Bertie tapped the doctor's name into a search engine and found news of a settlement for overdiagnosis in a guardianship case. Scrubbed from most websites, but fossilized in a blog by a crank who loved the law more than he loved himself. We found the deacon's brother-in-law's landscaping company's new contract with the church. We found a shell nonprofit registered 2 weeks ago, with a mission about supporting elder creativity, with Sloan listed as program director. We found that the truck that hit my Toyota belonged to a contractor who donated work to that same shell nonprofit. We found proof of nothing that would stand in a courtroom, and enough to make that kettle's scream sound like prophecy. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to give the people I loved the benefit of the doubt. Then I opened my front door the next morning to find a bouquet on my porch with a card that, instead of a name, carried a typed message. Some voices are too precious to be left unguided. The stems were wet. The flowers were funeral white. I sniffed them before common sense caught up with me. Bleach. Faint. As a memory. Grief is a cavern. Love is the rope nested inside it. Money is the wind that makes you misjudge your grip. I sat there on my steps with Bertie's notebook on my lap, and that smell in my nose, and decided that I would not die polite. The first step was to listen to my own breath until it matched the rhythm of a plan. The second was to invite my neighbor, EJ, who ran a podcast from his garage and had useful sins, namely, good microphones and better curiosity. He loved a story, the way a raccoon loves a shiny lid. We agreed that if there was nothing, he would delete what the wires caught and never speak of it again. If there was something, we would not be the first to hear it. Law would. We tucked a tiny recorder under the runner on my dining table. We put one in my cardigan pocket where my hand knew how to reach for comfort. Bertie taught me to look at a man's shoes when he lied, not his eyes. I made pound cake and set it to cool on the counter like a welcome mat. Malik arrived with Sloan and a new haircut clean part, sharp line and a nervous fidget brewing in his shoulders. Sloan wore a sweater that made her look like a professor you'd trust with a secret, and carried a folder that matched her nails. I hugged my son and kissed his cheek, and held him half a heartbeat longer than he expected. Then I made tea, and put the cups down exactly where they needed to go for the microphone under the runner to hear them. I asked about work. I asked about Nyla's school projects. I let them step into comfort's light, and then turned to face the darkness, waiting at the edges. I received a call I didn't ask for from a doctor I didn't choose, I said. I found flowers on my porch that smelled like something meant to make me scrub harder than necessary. I also found a shell nonprofit with your name on it, Sloan. Tell me that what I think I'm thinking is a plotline I made up because I binged true crime. Oh, Sloane's mouth softened into concern. Loretta, you've been under stress. It's not unusual to misread. Stop, I said. And the word came out quieter than my heartbeat, and sharper than bone. Malik's leg bounced under the table like a trapped bird. My son reached for my hand. Sloan reached for the folder. We want to help you, Ma, Malik said. This money, this is big. You need structure. I have structure. It's called a spine. What? Sloan smiled like a woman who gives toddlers apple slices and calls it pie. No one is trying to take anything from you, Loretta. We're trying to protect you from predators. Bertie would later replay the recording and point out the moment Sloane's vowels narrowed pressure. Calculation. The sound of a woman adjusting to a tighter dress. She slid the folder toward me. Inside were draft documents, a living trust, a durable power of attorney, a health proxy naming my son as agent. The language was the kind that folds its own arms and dares you to disagree. There were sticky notes in Sloane's neat hand. Sign here. Just initial basic. Who drew these up? I asked. Our attorney, Sloane said. Reverend Cole recommended him. Oh, I said. The pastor who can't remember my name unless I am holding a casserole. Huh. I read while Malik explained that it was temporary, that it was for my peace of mind, that the doctor could confirm my capacity, that if I didn't like it, we could dissolve it later. But buried there, in paragraph 17 of 25, was a clause written in the kind of English that makes you reach for a dictionary and then sit on your hands. It said that upon verified cognitive decline, my agent could move assets to the trust for the efficiency of management. It didn't say who would verify, only that 2 licensed professionals could agree. It didn't say which professionals. It didn't say that I had to be in the room when they did. I set the folder down and took a long drink of tea to keep my tongue from saying something it would set on fire. Malik, I said, voice steady because I was stepping on the fear where it was trying to rise. Do you remember the night in 1999 when your father taught you to change the oil and then watched you forget the plug and let that thick black truth pour across the driveway? He blinked and nodded. He didn't yell, I said. He put your hand in the oil and said, now you know its weight. I am putting your hand in this. Feel it. He leaned forward, eyes bright with a heat that could have been shame or anger. Ma, I'm trying to do right by you. Then do right beside me, not over me, I said. If I ever need a proxy, I will tell you the day my name is too heavy for my own mouth. He swallowed. Sloane's jaw moved like she was crushing ice between her molars. When they left Sloane with the folder, Malik with the scent of pound cake in his jacket and something heavier in his chest. Bertie came in from the porch where she had been listening through the open window with a face that said both I told you and I wish I had been wrong. EJ texted to say the microphones had done their little brave jobs, and he'd hand the files to Harrison first thing. Do you want me to run a story? He asked. Not yet, I wrote back. The court of public opinion ain't got bailiffs. By Friday, Reverend Cole was at my front door. He brought a potted plant and a speech about community and the burden of blessings. He sat in my living room and looked at my wedding photo like it was proof he'd known my heart longer than he had. When I told him I was choosing my own counsel and my own doctors, he sighed the sigh of a man who has never been told no by a woman who bakes. I hope you won't let fear harden your heart, he said. And I smiled with all my teeth and told him fear was what had kept me alive this long. He left with his plant and his sermon still folded and walked past Bertie's car without even seeing her. She lowered her scanner volume and called Harrison. Harrison called the district attorney's office. The district attorney called Adult Protective Services. Dr. Gupta faxed over a letter with 3 bold sentences. Patient-oriented. Lucid. In full command of her medical decisions. I pinned it to my bulletin board like a blue ribbon. Here is where the movies would make a tidy bow. Here is where the mother and the son would hug in a beam of kitchen sunlight, and the daughter-in-law would weep and apologize and mean it. But this is not that kind of story. This is a story about choosing what hurts in order to survive what kills. Sunday. Just as choir rehearsal was hitting that delicious groove between praise and sweat, Nyla texted me a link. It was a fundraiser for the Shell nonprofit. Live Now, with Sloane on video explaining how it would support grandmothers whose genius is being exploited by corporations. Her hair was perfect, and her voice carried the righteous tremor of the converted. Malik stood behind her, out of focus, holding a clipboard, and looking like a boy who hadn't learned that paper does not turn into a shield if you hide behind it. The goal was 50,000. They'd raised 12 in 20 minutes. The comments were full of hearts and hallelujahs. I nearly laughed in the middle of, "Ride on, King Jesus." Then I nearly cried. Then I caught my breath and sang my part. So true, it made the sopranos look back and grin like they were proud of me. After rehearsal, I sat on the choir loft steps and called Malik. He didn't answer. I called again. On the third ring, he picked up and said my name like a child who has just touched the stove. I love you, I said, before the rest of the words had a chance to push their way out. And you are in a room right now that will not hold you later. Come out. Ma, he said. It's just a fundraiser. For a lie, I said. For a thing that wraps itself in me and calls it a blanket. Silence. Then quiet crying, the kind that makes a throat feel like a fist. I don't want to be like this, he said. Then stop, I said, and let the line go soft between us. Sometimes the only bridge is shutting up and waiting. The next morning, a man in a suit came into Harrison's office with a smile so bland it could have been painted on. He said his name was Lyle Kerr, and he represented mutual interests. He placed a thick file on the table and patted it like a pet. He mentioned guardianship in a tone that tried to be polite and failed. Harrison smiled the way old oaks do, no teeth, all shade, and asked him to spell every name and cite every statute. Lyle did, and through the office window, I watched my city go about its business, while this man laid down the rails he believed I would be forced to ride. I thought of the postal inspectors who'd rooted out forged money orders from a strip mall 2 miles away. I thought of Bertie's purse swinging. I thought of Nyla's edible glitter. Harrison asked Lyle how long he had known Reverend Cole. Lyle blinked, like the thought had never occurred to him to try honesty, and said, long enough. By the time he stood, I could smell the worry on him like old cologne. As he left, he pointed at Harrison's fern and said, You should water that. As if he were generous and not grasping. Harrison watered it, while Bertie texted Detective Ramos, her favorite from the old days, and said the magic word, pattern. There are weeks when you feel like a person, and there are weeks when you feel like a docket. The next days were the latter. APS took my statement with kindness, threaded through their questions like a seam that wouldn't break. Dr. Gupta firmed his language to impenetrable. EJ kept the files tight. Bertie monitored the clinic that had conjured itself out of concern. The DA's office, alerted, asked for one thing we didn't yet have. A convergence. It's not enough to have a bouquet that smells wrong and a truck that hits a Toyota and a pastor who wants to shepherd money. You need the click of the trap you didn't set. It came on a Thursday afternoon, when I hadn't been expecting anything more than a quiet hour with my feet up and an old movie. Dr. Stanford called again. But this time she went straight to the pitch. I am booking you for a scan, she said. If you refuse, we may need to proceed with an emergency hearing for your safety. I told her, in my nicest choir alto, that the only emergency I had was running low on cinnamon, and then I asked her to please hold. I put her on speaker and set my phone down beside the microphone that had been waiting on my hall table like a sleeping dog. Then I took a breath made of 30 years of saying the right note the first time, and I walked next door. Bertie's door opened to the smell of onions and justice. She set her spoon down and pressed 2 buttons on the little device she trusted more than some men. We rolling, she said. I went back home and picked the phone up. I'm back, I said. Now, who referred you? Pastor Cole, she said, and I felt that click, clean and undeniable. And Mrs. Sloane Thompson. They're concerned about the magnitude of your decisions and your recent confusion while cooking. One, you mean my pound cake, I said. The one cooling on the counter. Listening to you right now, there was a pause, the kind where angels lean in. Miss Sullivan, she said. And I heard in the space after my name the realization that she had said too much. Say you'll come to me tomorrow at 10, she barreled on, gathering her feet under her again. We will make sure you are protected. I will be at Dr. Gupta's at 9, I said cheerfully, and he will be sending his report and a note about your phone call to the district attorney at 10. The silence that followed tasted like victory and old pennies both. When the line went dead, I leaned my forehead against the coolness of my wall and let myself laugh. Soft and mean and relieved. If joy is a psalm, some days you have to sing the version with a little cussing under your breath. The DA moved with the speed of people who have reached the end of their patience with a trick. Harrison scheduled a meeting for Monday with everyone in the same room. Lyle and Sloan and Reverend Cole, me and Bertie and Harrison and Dr. Gupta, and a prosecutor named Miss Fielder who wore flats like a declaration of war. The clinic was subpoenaed. EJ's files were logged and labeled like delicate fruit. APS rehearsed their questions. I baked 2-pound cakes, one for staff who have to ask strangers where it hurts all day long, and one for us. When Monday came, it rained with purpose. The city looked cleaner than it deserved. We sat in Harrison's conference room under the hum of lights that have seen divorces and mergers and men lie to themselves. Lyle held his mouth like a man trying to keep a taste out of it. Reverend Cole folded his hands like prayer could make the paper on the table turn to loaves and fishes. Sloan looked almost tired. It surprised me. It didn't excuse her. It did remind me that the hunger for control is its own starvation. Miss Fielder started. She thanked everyone for coming. She said, protective concern, like it was a dish somebody had oversalted. Then she pressed play on the audio. Doctor. Stanford's voice filled the room, sweet as antiseptic, and laid down the pattern, beat for beat, the referral, the emergency hearing threat, the pound cake. When it ended, nobody spoke for 3 breaths, and those 3 breaths were some of the best I've ever taken. Sloan broke first. We were trying to keep her safe, she said. And I believed she believed that sentence. Right up until she said, her assets. In the next one without meaning to. Miss Fielder didn't blink. We'll be in touch, she said, which is prosecutor for, I'm going to take your day apart and hand it back to you in labeled bags. APS asked their questions. I answered in full sentences. Harrison slid papers toward Lyle that made Lyle's neck blotch at the edges. Reverend Cole quoted a verse about shepherding. I quoted the one about wolves in sheep clothing. Bertie watched every shoe. When we left, the rain had stopped. The sky was that particular shade of stubborn blue that says it knows what it's doing. There is a cost to winning. I paid it on a Wednesday when Malik came to my house in the late afternoon with his shoulders lowered and put his palms on my table like he was bracing for a wave. He cried for the boy he'd been and for the man he hadn't been yet. He told me Sloan had moved out. He told me he had called Dr. Stanford and told her to lose his number. And he said it in a voice that dreamed of being steady and wasn't there yet. He told me the fundraiser had returned its donations. He told me he had told Reverend Cole he was changing churches. Then he asked me if I could forgive him. Forgiveness is carpentry. You measure twice, you cut once, and then you sand and sand and sand. And sometimes you set the whole thing aside and come back after supper with a steadier hand. I told him I could forgive the fear that made him reach for an easy fix. I told him I could forgive the flattery he mistook for wisdom. I told him I could not forgive, not yet, the decision to sign my name to papers I hadn't read. He nodded like a man who finally decides to let the weight teach him. We ate our supper. I wrapped pound cake for him to take home. He left my house the way he had come into the world. Afraid, determined, loved. Months turn. Checks clear. Lawyers call. I bought myself new windows and a used sedan with a backup camera that beeped so politely it made me want to apologize for existing. I hired an accountant who wore cardigans like armor and loved a spreadsheet more than food. I made a list of every woman who had taught me something useful: how to sing without hurting my throat, how to say no without apologizing first, how to find the leak in a lie, and I started a fund in their names. We called it the Porchlight Fund because when I was a girl in Jackson, Mississippi, my mama would leave that light on for anybody who might be walking home late, and the knowledge of its glow could get you through a dark block. The porchlight paid for legal consults for elders whose kin had started using words like stewardship and concern where love should be. It funded community workshops on rights and decency. It hired Bertie part-time to teach Suspicious and Sweet how to say bless your heart while dialing a lawyer. It sent Nyla to a summer camp for girls who wanted to build apps that could listen for code words in phone calls and send alerts to their aunties. It made a donation in honor of the Mount Zion Broadcast Chorale to the music school, 2 neighborhoods over, so some girl who hasn't learned to be quiet yet can put her voice on a track that will feed her in 40 years. People ask me if I sing anymore. I do, but not like I used to when I thought my voice had to be big to be real. Now I sing while I tape cardboard boxes on Wednesdays at the food pantry, while I stir grits for the breakfast ministry that refuses to shrink even when prices rise. I sing while I sit with Miss Sadie from up the street, while she signs papers that will keep her house hers. I sing when Nyla shows me a video of her generation being fearless and foolish and beautiful and wrong, and so sure they're right, it makes me ache with memory. Malik? He found a job at a community legal clinic intake, mostly, and running copies and showing folks where to sit. He says, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," to people who don't hear those words much anymore. He joined a different church with a pastor who preaches short and listens long. He brings Nyla to my house on Friday nights and sits at my table without looking at my mail. It's a miracle, which is to say it took work, and it keeps taking it. Months after the settlement hit my account and the porch light put its first pamphlets into wrinkled hands, I got a package from Los Angeles. Inside was a framed gold record and a note in the global artist's handwriting. "Your voice raised me," it said. "Thank you for letting me sample your courage." I put the frame on my hallway wall where I pass it when I go to take the trash out. I smile at it like it's a neighbor and keep moving. Here is the part you came for. The part where I tell you what I learned when the kettle screamed and the pickup found my car and the word conservatorship slid into my world like a bad song on the radio. I learned that boundaries are a form of love, not a lack of it. I learned that money is not evil. It is a mirror, and everybody will check their hair in it whether they admit it or not. I learned that the people who say they are protecting your legacy might be reaching for the light switch, and that true protection looks like sitting beside you while you file your nails and choose your own doctor and decide if tonight is a cornbread night or a biscuit night. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean reunion. Sometimes it means closing your door and leaving the porch light on anyway. So, someone who decides to come correct can see the path. And I learned that my voice, this black woman's instrument, honed in a pew and tempered by grief, was not waiting for a sample to be worthy. It was always my inheritance. The rest is distribution. If this story gave you something strength, side-eye, a song to hum, while you wash your dishes, tap that like. Share it with somebody who needs a porch light. Subscribe for more of these kitchen table confessions, and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I'll be right here, humming, reading, leaving the light on.